He stood there on the sidewalk he had swept every morning, an elderly man holding nothing more threatening than a paper bag with his blood pressure medication inside. He wasn't armed. He wasn't threatening anyone. Then a cop pulled up, stepped out of his cruiser, and slapped him so hard his glasses shattered on the concrete. The whole town saw it on video. The police chief called it a misunderstanding. The mayor said, "Let the process work." But nobody, not one single person in that courtroom, knew that the old man's youngest son had just flown in from Washington. Nobody knew what badge he was carrying in his jacket pocket until he walked through that door. Clarence Bennett had lived on Pine Street in Brookside, Alabama. He had moved there with his wife Evelyn when the town was still the kind of place where a black family settling on a quiet street caused curtains to move in neighboring windows and conversations to drop to whispers at the hardware store. Clarence had survived all of it, the whispers, the anonymous notes left on his porch, the evening when someone spray-painted a single ugly word across his mailbox. He had survived because he was the kind of man who answered ugliness with consistency. He swept his porch and the sidewalk in front of his house. He grew tomatoes in the side yard. He volunteered at Grace Baptist Church, running the food pantry with Evelyn until she passed from breast cancer, and then he ran it alone. Clarence Bennett was not a large man. He stood 5'8" and had lost weight since Evelyn died. Weight he couldn't seem to get back no matter how many casseroles the church ladies brought. He wore thick-frame glasses because his eyes had started failing him. He walked with a slight lean to the left because of an old back injury from his time working at the county water treatment plant. He had retired with a modest pension, a plaque on the wall, and the respect of every man and woman who had worked under him. One ordinary day, Clarence had one simple errand. He needed to pick up his blood pressure prescription from the pharmacy 4 blocks from his house. His doctor had called him personally the day before to remind him not to skip the refill. His pressure had been running high. He needed to stay on schedule. Clarence put on his good brown coat, the one Evelyn had bought him years ago, tucked the pharmacy receipt into his pocket, and walked out into a cool Alabama morning. He never made it back home standing straight. Derek Morgan had been with the Brookside Police Department. In those years, he had accumulated the kind of record that police departments in small Alabama towns used to tolerate and sometimes quietly celebrate. Multiple use-of-force complaints, formal grievances filed by citizens, most of them black, settlements paid out by the city's insurance fund for incidents involving traffic stops that escalated in ways the dashcam footage never quite captured cleanly. His sergeant had described Morgan in annual reviews as aggressive but effective, which in the culture of the Brookside PD meant he cleared calls fast and didn't ask too many questions about how. Morgan was the son of a former Brookside cop. He bowled with other officers and city council members. He had a thin blue line tattoo on his left forearm and had once kept a Confederate flag phone case before a department memo made him switch it out for a plain black one, while still displaying a small rebel flag sticker on his personal truck's rear window. On routine patrol, Morgan pulled his cruiser onto Center Street. He would later claim he had received a dispatch call about a suspicious individual matching Clarence Bennett's description, an older black man loitering near the pharmacy. The dispatch log would later become a central piece of evidence in what followed, because the log showed no such call had been made, not one. What it showed was that Morgan had self-initiated the stop. He pulled over. He got out. He walked up to Clarence Bennett, who was standing at the corner waiting for the crosswalk signal with a paper pharmacy bag in his hand. Hey, old man, what are you doing?" Clarence turned. He had seen police officers approach him before. He knew in the way that every black man of his generation knew how to keep his hands visible and his voice calm, and his eyes direct but not challenging. He had taught this to his sons the way his own father had taught it to him. an inheritance no man should have to pass down. But all of them did. "Just picked up my prescription," Clarence said, heading home. "You got ID?" "I do." Clarence moved slowly, deliberately, to reach into his coat pocket. What happened next was captured on the phone camera of Sophia Ramirez, a pharmacy technician who was on her lunch break across the street. Her phone was already up because she had seen Morgan approach, and something in her stomach had tightened. The footage is short. Clarence Bennett reaches into his coat pocket. He produces not a weapon, not a threat, but a state ID and the pharmacy receipt. The receipt with his name, his doctor's name, and the medication on it. He holds both out toward Officer Morgan. Morgan doesn't take them. Instead, he says something. The audio is partially obscured by street noise, but audio forensic analysts would later enhance it and testify to what they heard. "Don't get smart with me, boy." And then he slaps Clarence Bennett across the face. Open hand, hard. The crack of it is audible on the recording. Clarence stumbles backward. His glasses fly off his face and shatter when they hit the curb. He hits the wall of the building behind him and slides partially down it before catching himself. The pharmacy bag drops. The pill bottle rolls into the street. Sophia Ramirez is heard on the video, gasping and then screaming. 3 other people on the street stop walking. A car slows. Morgan looks around. He sees the phone. He sees the people. He gets back in his cruiser. He drives away without filing a report. The video had been viewed hundreds of thousands of times. It was at millions. When Clarence Bennett sat at his kitchen table with a bruise across his left cheek and his spare pair of glasses taped at the bridge, his name was being spoken on national news and every local affiliate between Birmingham and Mobile. The Brookside Police Department released a statement. Chief Alan Brooks, a veteran of the department who had hired Morgan and had signed off on each of Morgan's cleared complaints, stood at a podium and said the following. "We are aware of a video circulating on social media depicting an interaction between one of our officers and a community member. We take all allegations of misconduct seriously and have initiated an internal review. Officer Morgan has been placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of that review. We ask the community to allow the process to work." He did not say Clarence Bennett's name. He did not call it an assault. He did not answer questions. Mayor Richard Caldwell released a written statement from his office that was short and contained the phrase "ongoing investigation" twice. He did not call Clarence Bennett either. Clarence's oldest son, Kevin Bennett, a high school principal in Birmingham, drove to Brookside. He sat across the table from his father and held the old man's hands and listened as Clarence described what had happened in the flat, measured tone of a man who had spent a lifetime learning not to let his rage spill over. Because he knew what spilling over cost a black man in this country. "He called me boy," Clarence said. Kevin stared at the table. "I worked for a long time and I paid my taxes and I buried your mother. And I still can't walk 4 blocks to pick up my medicine." Kevin called an attorney, a civil rights lawyer named David Coleman out of Birmingham, who had handled multiple high-profile police misconduct cases. Coleman drove down, reviewed the video, reviewed Morgan's record, and told Clarence Bennett he had one of the strongest cases he had ever seen. But Coleman had worked in Alabama long enough to know that strong cases and just outcomes were not the same thing. What nobody in the room mentioned, what Kevin had deliberately not mentioned yet, was their younger brother, because their younger brother worked for the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and he was already on a plane. Nathan Bennett was a special agent with the FBI's Civil Rights Division. He had not always been FBI. He had gone to college on an academic scholarship, graduated with a degree in criminal justice, done time with the State Bureau of Investigation, and then passed the FBI entrance exam on his first attempt. He had worked out of the Birmingham field office before being recruited to the Civil Rights Division in Washington, where his particular expertise in pattern analysis in law enforcement misconduct cases, specifically in jurisdictions with histories of systemic discrimination, had made him one of the more respected analysts in his unit. He was not a headline agent. He was not the kind of FBI agent you saw on the news giving press conferences. He was the kind of agent who spent months building a case so airtight that when it finally went to a grand jury, it did not fail. He had been part of teams that had brought federal charges against officers in multiple states. He understood how these cases worked. He understood how they were won and lost. He also understood something more personal. He had grown up watching his father navigate this country with patience and dignity and grace. And he had always known, in the way children of black men his father's generation always knew, that one day the country might show his father exactly what it thought of all that patience and dignity and grace. He had hoped he was wrong. When Kevin called him, Nathan was already watching the video on his laptop in his apartment in Alexandria, Virginia. He had watched it multiple times. "I'm coming," he said, before Kevin had finished the first sentence. "Kevin, you don't have to." "I'm coming." He called his supervisor, Assistant Special Agent in Charge Donna Hargrave, before he booked his flight. He told her what had happened. He told her he was going to Alabama as a family member, not as an agent, but that he was flagging it because she needed to know. Hargrave was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Keep me informed. And Nathan, document everything." He understood what she meant. He landed in Birmingham, rented a car, and drove to Brookside. He did not announce himself. He did not go to the police department. He did not speak to any press. He went to his father's house, sat at the same kitchen table where Kevin was already sitting, and held his father the way a federal agent holds the man who taught him how to be a man, which is to say, silently and for a long time. The preliminary hearing for the civil complaint filed by David Coleman on behalf of Clarence Bennett was scheduled in the Brookside Municipal Courthouse, a building that had last been renovated long ago and still had the faint smell of old wood and old decisions in its walls. Derek Morgan sat at the defense table with his attorney, a man named Philip Grant, who specialized in representing law enforcement officers in Alabama and had a record of making cases like this one go away. Grant was expensive and he was good, and the Brookside Police Benevolent Association was paying his full rate. Morgan had given one statement to the internal affairs investigator, in which he claimed Clarence had been moving erratically and that he had lost his footing during what Morgan described as a routine field interview. He did not explain how a man losing his footing produced a bruise in the exact shape and distribution of an open-hand strike across the left cheek. He did not address the audio enhancement of the word boy. Chief Alan Brooks sat in the gallery behind Morgan in his full-dress uniform. Mayor Richard Caldwell was not present, but two of his aides were. The courtroom was packed. Grace Baptist Church had organized a quiet, dignified showing of support. Dozens of Clarence's fellow congregants, most of them elderly, sitting in pressed Sunday clothes in the gallery behind the plaintiff's table. Local press was present. 2 Birmingham television cameras were set up in the back. Clarence Bennett sat next to David Coleman in a charcoal gray suit that Evelyn had picked out for him. His spare glasses were still taped at the bridge. Kevin sat in the first row of the gallery directly behind him. Nathan sat 3 rows back. He was wearing a plain dark jacket and slacks. Nobody except his brother knew who he was or what he carried in the inside pocket of that jacket. The hearing began. Judge Patricia Hayes, a woman who had been on the Brookside Municipal Bench, called the room to order. The first part was procedural. Motions from Grant to limit the scope of the video evidence. Motions from Coleman to introduce Morgan's prior complaint history. Judge Hayes ruled on each with the careful neutrality of a judge who was aware of how many cameras were in her courtroom. Then Philip Grant did something that nobody had anticipated. He called a witness. The witness was a man named Frank Ellis, a white man who claimed to have been standing on Center Street the day of the incident. Ellis testified in a voice that was just confident enough to sound rehearsed without quite sounding scripted, that he had seen Clarence Bennett acting aggressive toward Officer Morgan, that Clarence had raised his voice and moved toward the officer in a threatening manner, and that what he had seen on the video didn't capture what had really happened because the angle was wrong. The gallery stirred. David Coleman let Ellis finish. Then Coleman stood up. "Mr. Ellis, where exactly were you standing?" Ellis gave an intersection. "And what time did you arrive at that intersection?" Ellis gave a time. Coleman picked up a document. "Mr. Ellis, are you aware that the Center Street intersection has a city-maintained traffic camera on the southwest corner?" The courtroom went quiet. Grant was already on his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. Foundation." Coleman was already handing the document to the clerk. "Your Honor, I'd like to introduce footage from the Center Street Municipal Traffic Camera, obtained via public records request to the Brookside Department of Transportation." Judge Hayes looked at the document. She looked at Grant. "Overruled. I'll allow it." The footage was played. Frank Ellis was not on Center Street that day, not at the intersection he named, not at any intersection on the block. The gallery erupted. Judge Hayes banged her gavel. Grant's face had gone the color of old chalk. Coleman turned to face Ellis in the witness stand. "Mr. Ellis, who asked you to testify today?" "Objection." "I'll rephrase. Mr. Ellis, have you ever spoken with Officer Derek Morgan or any member of the Brookside Police Department prior to today?" Ellis's jaw moved. He said nothing. "Mr. Ellis, I know some of the guys from the department socially." "Socially?" Coleman repeated. In the third row of the gallery, Nathan Bennett was writing something in a small notebook. His expression had not changed. The hearing recessed for lunch. During the recess, Philip Grant received a phone call in the courthouse parking lot. Court security cameras recorded him pacing during the call, and then standing very still for the last seconds of it. When court reconvened, Grant informed the judge that his client wished to make a statement. Morgan stood. He had prepared something. It was visible. A folded piece of paper he held in both hands. He read from it in a voice that was clearly aimed at the cameras in the back of the room. "I want to acknowledge that the interaction I had with Mr. Bennett on that day did not reflect the professional standards of the Brookside Police Department, and I regret any distress it caused to Mr. Bennett and his family. I have the utmost respect for the community." "Excuse me." The voice came from the back of the courtroom. Every head turned. Nathan Bennett was standing up. He was not looking at Morgan. He was looking at Judge Hayes. "Your Honor, I apologize for the interruption. My name is Nathan Bennett. Clarence Bennett is my father." He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. He produced his credentials, the leather fold, the gold badge, the FBI identification card, and held them up so the judge could see them clearly. "I'm a special agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Civil Rights Division. I'm here today as a family member, not in an official capacity, but I want to inform the court that I submitted a formal referral to my division recommending a federal civil rights investigation into this incident and into the broader pattern of conduct complaints against Officer Morgan and the Brookside Police Department." The courtroom did not erupt this time. It went completely, utterly silent. Derek Morgan's face, the face of a man who had slapped an elderly man across the face on a public street and driven away, who had been protected by his department and his union and a false witness, went the color of ash. Chief Allen Brooks, sitting in full dress uniform in the gallery, put both hands flat on his knees. Grant stood up. "Your Honor, this is completely improper. Judge Hayes held up one hand. She was looking at Nathan Bennett with an expression that no one in the room could entirely read. Something between recognition and something that might have been, under her judicial composure, relief. "Agent Bennett," she said carefully, "you're here as a private citizen today?" "Yes, Your Honor. But the referral you mentioned, that's a matter of federal record." "Filed this morning, Your Honor. Case reference number available to any party who requests it through official channels." Grant sat down slowly, like a man who suddenly understood the floor might not hold him. Nathan sat down too. He looked at his father's back, the thin brown coat, the taped glasses, the straight-held spine of a man who had been getting up and sweeping sidewalk through everything this country had thrown at him. Clarence Bennett did not turn around, but he reached back with one hand and held it out, and Nathan took it. What followed was not television drama. It was the quieter, more thorough kind of dismantling, the kind that happens in federal records requests, in depositions, in the careful examination of phone records and department logs and emails that people wrote assuming no one with real authority would ever read them. The FBI's Civil Rights Division opened a formal pattern or practice investigation into the Brookside Police Department. The investigation was assigned to a team of agents and a supervising attorney named Susan Thompson, who had spent years in the Justice Department and had led similar investigations in other states. Thompson's team began by pulling every use of force report filed in the Brookside PD. What they found was not surprising to anyone who had been paying attention, but it was documented now in the precise and prosecutable language of federal review. Of the use of force incidents recorded, the vast majority involved Black or Latino civilians. Of Morgan's complaints specifically, most had been filed by Black civilians. Of the formal grievances, the ones that had gone through the city's process, most had been downgraded to unfounded or officer justified by the same internal affairs investigator, a sergeant named Henry Doyle, who had also happened to have been Derek Morgan's training officer when Morgan joined the department. Henry Doyle retired abruptly after receiving a federal subpoena. Chief Alan Brooks did not retire. He was given the opportunity in a closed meeting with the city attorney, Mayor Caldwell, and a representative from the FBI field office. He chose instead to fight it, which was his right. He retained an attorney and issued a public statement defending his department's record. It was the wrong decision because Thompson's team, by this point, had the emails. The emails were from the departmental server obtained via federal subpoena. They were not individually the kind of emails that made immediate headlines. They were instead the accumulation of a culture. Jokes that weren't jokes. Language that was consistent and directional. References to Black civilians in terms that were not fit to reproduce. Specific discussions between Brooks and Morgan and two other officers about how to document stops in ways that would be defensible. The emails also contained, buried in a thread from earlier, a discussion about Clarence Bennett specifically. Clarence Bennett, who had attended city council meetings to speak during public comment about issues affecting elderly residents, had apparently attracted the attention of someone in the department. The thread referred to Clarence as that old agitator on Pine Street and included a response from Morgan that said simply, "I know who he is. I got it." Before the incident on Center Street, Derek Morgan had been assigned to patrol the Center Pine corridor. It had not been random. When this information became public through a carefully managed leak to the Birmingham News that originated from a source no one ever officially identified, though David Coleman received an anonymous text message before the story ran that said simply, "Check your email," the Brookside story changed entirely. It stopped being a story about one cop having a bad day. It became something older and more deliberate and more damning. Derek Morgan was indicted by a federal grand jury on counts of deprivation of rights under color of law. the federal statute used to prosecute law enforcement officers who violate constitutional rights. The specific charge related to the assault on Clarence Bennett. A second count added by the grand jury on its own motion, after reviewing the email evidence, alleged a pattern of racially motivated selective enforcement. Philip Grant, Morgan's attorney, held a press conference outside the federal courthouse in Birmingham and used phrases like prosecutorial overreach and good officer and political climate. He looked like a man reading words he did not fully believe. Chief Alan Brooks resigned. The city issued a statement thanking him for his service. Mayor Richard Caldwell announced he would not seek re-election. The city of Brookside, Alabama reached a civil settlement with Clarence Bennett. The amount was not disclosed publicly, but David Coleman confirmed it was substantial and included, at Clarence's specific request, 3 non-monetary provisions: a permanent civilian oversight board for the Brookside PD, mandatory body camera activation policies, and a public acknowledgement on city letterhead signed by the mayor that Clarence Bennett had done nothing wrong, that he had been targeted, and that the city was sorry. The letter took hours to negotiate. Clarence Bennett framed it and hung it in his kitchen next to a photograph of Evelyn. The law handled what the law could handle. But there were other things that happened in the margins of the official record that were, in their own way, as consequential. Frank Ellis, the false witness, was charged with perjury in Alabama state court. His attorney, a public defender, negotiated a plea to a lesser charge. Ellis was sentenced to community service. He performed hours of it at the Grace Baptist Church food pantry, where Clarence Bennett still volunteered. Ellis arrived to find Clarence Bennett already at the distribution table stacking cans. They didn't speak for the first hours. Then during a break, Ellis sat on a folding chair near the door with a cup of coffee, and Clarence walked past him, and Ellis said quietly, "I'm sorry, Mr. Bennett." Clarence stopped. He looked at this man, clearly frightened, clearly ashamed, clearly not fully aware of what he had inserted himself into when he agreed to lie for Derek Morgan in exchange for what the indictment later revealed was a promise of a reference for a city contract bid. Clarence said, "I know you are." He poured himself a cup of coffee and sat down in the chair next to the man who had lied about him in a courtroom. And they sat there for minutes, not saying much. Then they went back to work. This is not in any court record. Sophia Ramirez, the pharmacy technician who filmed the original video, knew about it because she had started volunteering at the pantry herself, partly out of guilt for the time it had taken her to post the video publicly, partly because she'd met Clarence at the civil hearing and found him to be the kind of person who makes you want to be better. Sophia was applying to nursing school. Henry Doyle, the retired internal affairs sergeant, cooperated with federal investigators in exchange for immunity from prosecution. His cooperation was what gave Thompson's team the specific knowledge that the use of force reviews had been deliberately manipulated. He gave a deposition that lasted hours across days. He cried during it. Once, when he described the clearing a complaint against Morgan for an incident involving a teenager who had been pulled from his bicycle during a stop and had his wrist broken. And once, when an investigator asked him if he had ever been afraid to tell the truth. The teenager's family was contacted by Coleman's office. His case was reopened. The 2 other officers named in the email chain were placed on administrative suspension, pending the outcome of the federal investigation. One resigned. The other was ultimately not charged federally, but was terminated by the city following the investigation's public report, which named him by name in connection with specific incidents. Derek Morgan's trial was scheduled later. He rejected plea offers. His attorney, Grant, had begun to quietly distance himself from the case. His firm released a statement announcing that due to conflicts, he would be withdrawing as counsel. Morgan was eventually represented by a public defender, a young woman who was only out of law school, had never tried a federal civil rights case, and spent months before trial reading case law until her eyes ached. She did her best. Her best was not enough. During the trial, the prosecution played the enhanced audio of the word boy. They played the email chain. They introduced testimony from the teenager, now older, speaking in a voice that was controlled and clear and devastating about what it had felt like to have his bicycle knocked out from under him and his wrist grabbed and twisted while he asked what he had done wrong and received no answer. The jury, drawn from the greater Birmingham area, deliberated for hours. Derek Morgan was convicted on both counts. He was sentenced to time in federal prison. He served every day of it. There are things that don't resolve the way justice is supposed to resolve them. The law has a shape to it, a beginning, a middle, an end, a filing date, a hearing, a verdict, a sentence. It moves in one direction, and it arrives somewhere you can point to on a calendar. Sentence served. Settlement reached. Chief resigned. Mayor not seeking re-election. You can write those things in a column, and they look like resolution. They look like the world correcting itself. But Clarence Bennett still woke up early every morning. He still made his coffee in the same percolator Evelyn had bought at a garage sale, the one Kevin kept telling him to replace, and that he kept not replacing, because the coffee it made tasted exactly right. He still stood at the kitchen window while it brewed and looked out at the side yard, where his tomato plants were either coming in well or not, depending on the rain. He still put on his brown coat when the mornings were cool. He still walked to the pharmacy when he needed his prescription, because it was blocks away and he was not going to stop walking blocks to do what he had always done. He had decided that after the incident, lying in bed with ice on his cheek, and he had not revisited the decision since. The bruise healed. These things always heal. It went from a deep reddish purple in the first days, the color of a thunderhead, to a flatter, older purple, then to the yellowed green of something fading, then to nothing. His skin took it and absorbed it the way skin absorbs most things, quietly and without asking for recognition. His new glasses were lighter than the old ones. Kevin had driven him to the optometrist and insisted on paying for the good frames, and Clarence had let him, because Kevin needed to do something useful with his hands during that period. And buying his father good glasses was something useful. They fit well. The lenses were a slightly updated prescription, and the world came in a little sharper than it had been, edges more defined, text easier, the faces of people across a room less blurred. He supposed there was something to be said for that. But some nights, not every night, not even most nights, but some. He sat at the kitchen table after the late news and felt something settle over him that he couldn't name with the precision he would have preferred. Clarence Bennett was a man who believed in naming things correctly. He had run the water treatment plants division, and the first thing he had taught every new hire was, if you don't know what the problem is, name it exactly, because a vague diagnosis produces a vague fix, and a vague fix produces the same problem on a longer timeline. So he sat with this feeling and tried to name it honestly. It wasn't bitterness. He had made a decision about bitterness. He had felt bitterness then, the real thing, sharp-edged and hot. He had sat with it, and then he had looked at it clearly and understood that it would cost more than it was worth. Not because the anger behind it was wrong. The anger was entirely right. But because bitterness turned the anger inward. And inward was the wrong direction. He had let it go. Not the anger, just the bitterness. He had kept the anger and put it somewhere useful. It wasn't grief either. Though grief was always present in a background way since Evelyn. Grief had a specific texture he knew well by now. The way it ambushed you in grocery stores when you reflexively reached for the brand of crackers she liked. the way it lived in the particular afternoon light of a Sunday when she would have been in the kitchen, and the house would have been full of a certain kind of sound. He knew grief. This was adjacent to grief, but not the same thing. What it was, he finally decided, sitting at the table with a cup of chamomile tea. The verdict fresh was the exhaustion of having been right about the danger. There is no satisfaction in that kind of rightness. He had told his sons when they were young, told them the way his own father had told him, factually and without drama, the way you tell a child that a stove is hot, not to frighten them, but because they need to know that this country had a particular relationship with black men, and that relationship required navigation. He had taught them how to put their hands where they could be seen. He had taught them how to keep their voice level and their eyes direct, but not challenging. He had taught them, and he had hoped the lesson would become less necessary, that the world would shift enough, that his grandsons, Kevin's boys, would not need to be taught the same thing. He was still hoping that. But hope and exhaustion can coexist in the same chest, and that night they did. He finished his tea and washed the cup and went to bed. He went back to the food pantry. He had been going for a long time, and he saw no reason to stop. Some of the church members had suggested gently that he might want to take some time, that he had been through something, that it was all right to rest. Clarence had listened to each of them with the full attention he gave everything, and then he had shown up early to help unload the delivery van because the pantry opened soon, and the cans didn't stack themselves. The day he was back, Frank Ellis arrived. Clarence had known Ellis would be coming. David Coleman had informed him of the community service arrangement before it was finalized, giving Clarence the opportunity to object if he chose. Clarence had not objected. He had thought about it, and then told Coleman that it was fine, that the man should do his hours somewhere useful. What he had not anticipated was what it would feel like to see him walk through the door. Ellis was a medium-sized white man with the look of someone who had spent time not sleeping well, a specific kind of worn quality around the eyes that Clarence recognized because he had seen it in mirrors. He came in quietly, spoke to the church volunteer coordinator, a woman named Betty Lawson, and was given an apron and a set of tasks, and went to work without making eye contact with anyone. Clarence watched him from across the room for a while, not with malice, more the way you watch something you're trying to understand. They worked in the same building for hours without speaking. The pantry was busy. It often was at the end of the month when money ran thin, and there was enough to do that silence between two people who didn't know each other was unremarkable. Clarence worked his station. Ellis worked his. During the break, Clarence poured himself coffee and walked toward the door to get some air. And Ellis was sitting there on a folding chair with his own cup and his eyes on the floor, and he said it without looking up. "I'm sorry, Mr. Bennett." Clarence stopped. He looked at this man. He thought about what it must take to say those words in this building to this person, and he thought about what Coleman had told him, that Ellis had agreed to lie in exchange for a city contract reference, which meant he had weighed one man's dignity against a business opportunity and chosen the business opportunity, which was a particular kind of cowardice that Clarence understood as very human, even while finding it contemptible. He thought about what his father used to say, which was that every man who does a wrong thing is not a wrong man, and that the difference between the two is what they do with the weight of it afterward. He looked at Ellis on the folding chair with his untouched coffee, and his eyes on the floor. "I know you are," Clarence said. He poured himself a cup of coffee and sat down in the empty chair next to the man who had lied about him in a courtroom. And they sat there for minutes not saying much. Then they went back to work. Clarence didn't tell Kevin or Nathan about it, not because he was hiding it, but because it felt like something that didn't need to be packaged into a story. It had happened. It was its own thing. It belonged to that Sunday morning and the folding chairs and the rectangles of light on the floor. Nathan came down from Washington. He drove this time instead of flying. Said he'd wanted the hours in the car to think, which Clarence understood. Nathan had always processed things best in motion, even as a child. He'd been the one who needed to pace while he talked, who came home from school and walked the yard before he'd say what kind of day it had been. Kevin drove down from Birmingham, and the three of them were together for the first time since the hearing. They ate ribs from a place on Main Road that did a dry rub Clarence had liked. They sat on the back porch as the afternoon went along, and the Alabama heat turned from the flat white heat of midday into something softer, bronzed. The kind of heat that felt like the day deciding to let you go. They talked about the case, about Morgan's trial, about the federal investigation report that would be made public later, about the teenager and the fact that his family had finally been reached and his case reopened. They talked about Kevin's school, about a particular student Kevin was worried about, a teenager whose home situation sounded unstable. They talked about Nathan's next assignment, which he couldn't detail, but which would take him to a city in the Mid-South. Then, the way it happens when family is comfortable with itself, they stopped talking about any of it and just sat. The yard moved in a slight evening breeze. Clarence's tomatoes were coming in. A good year, better than last year. The rains having cooperated. Fireflies were beginning in the lower part of the yard near the fence. Small, hesitant lights trying themselves out against the dimming sky. Dad. Nathan was looking at the yard. I need to ask you something. Ask. Are you okay? Actually okay, not what you tell people. Clarence let the question sit for a moment. He appreciated that Nathan had phrased it the way he had. The distinction between the performance of okay and the actual thing. Nathan had always been precise with language in the way that FBI agents became precise, which was also the way that honest people were precise. I'm okay, Clarence said. I'm tired. Been tired, but I'm okay. Nathan nodded. He didn't push, which was the right thing. I'll tell you what I think about, Clarence said after a while. I think about Sophia, that girl who filmed it. She told me when I met her at the hearing that she'd been standing there for almost a minute before she held up the phone, almost a minute watching it happen, being scared about what would happen if she filmed it and what would happen if she didn't. He shook his head slowly. She was on her lunch break. She filmed it anyway. He looked at the fireflies. There's always somebody who films it. Always somebody who tells the truth. The problem isn't that people don't see. It's that the people with the power to do something about what they see take their time about it. He paused. But Sophia didn't take her time. The teenager didn't take his time when he testified. You didn't take your time. He glanced at Nathan. You were already watching the video when Kevin called. Minutes before he called, Nathan said quietly. I know. Clarence put his hand on his son's arm. I know, son. They sat with that. Your mother would have wanted every detail, Clarence said. His voice changed on her. It always did. Softened in a register that he couldn't control and had stopped trying to. She would have been in that courtroom in her good hat, the blue one with the brim. She would have sat right behind David Coleman, and she would have looked at Derek Morgan the whole time and never flinched. Kevin made a sound, something between a laugh and something else. She would have brought food, he said. She would have brought a whole pan of something for the church members who came, and she would have organized a carpool. She would have called the mayor herself, Nathan said. She would have called the mayor. Clarence agreed. and the mayor would have called her back because everyone called Evelyn Bennett back. Everyone in their right mind returned Evelyn Bennett's calls. They were all laughing now, the way you laugh about someone gone fully without guilt, because they were worth remembering in full color and full sound. The laughter went out into the yard, over the tomatoes, up past the early dark, where the fireflies were doing their patient blinking work. Clarence looked at his garden. He thought about how many mornings he had come out here and put his hands in this dirt since she had been gone, and how the tomatoes had come anyway, and how that was either something comforting or something lonely depending on the day, and how most days lately it was both at once. He thought about the folding chair next to Frank Ellis. He thought about the teenager crossing the street with his uncomfortable gratitude and his open hand. He thought about Sophia Ramirez, who had started volunteering at the food pantry and who had told Clarence she'd been accepted to the nursing program at the University of Alabama. He thought about the letter on the wall in the kitchen, city letterhead, mayor's signature. The words Clarence Bennett did nothing wrong in black ink that would last longer than the men who had to be compelled to write it. He thought about Evelyn's photograph next to it. He stood up slowly, the back taking its time the way it did in the evenings now, and looked out at his yard in the dark. "Come on," he said to his sons. "Let me show you how the tomatoes came in." The three of them walked down the porch steps into the warm night, into the yard that Clarence Bennett had kept on a street that had not always wanted him. And they walked among the plants in the dark, and the fireflies moved around them, without agenda or meaning, blinking their small lights on and off the way small lights do, persistent, patient, refusing to stop. Clarence Bennett went to pick up his blood pressure medication and came home with a bruise on his face and a broken pair of glasses. He was an elderly man, a retired public servant, a widower, a churchman, a man who swept his sidewalk every morning. He was targeted deliberately, struck without cause, and then told by the systems designed to protect him to wait, to be patient, to let the process work. The process worked, but not the way they intended, because they didn't know about Nathan. They didn't know about Sophia and her phone. They didn't know about the teenager and his bicycle, or the emails they had written, assuming no one would ever read them, or the jury that would sit and listen to all of it and come back with a verdict that said, "Clearly not this time." Clarence's story is not just one man's story. It is the story of what happens when ordinary people refuse to look away, when a young woman holds up her phone, when a son walks into a courtroom with a badge, when an old man sits on a folding chair next to the man who lied about him and says, "I know you are." In the quiet streets of a small Alabama town, an elderly man named Clarence Bennett stepped out one ordinary morning to pick up his blood pressure medication, carrying nothing but a paper bag and decades of quiet dignity. What should have been a simple 4-block walk ended with a shocking slap from a police officer, shattered glasses, and a bruise that marked far more than his cheek. Yet, from that painful moment rose one of life's most profound lessons. True justice often arrives not through dramatic showdowns or instant revenge, but through the steady, courageous persistence of ordinary people who refuse to look away. Clarence's story reminds us that real strength isn't loud or flashy. It lives in the man who sweeps his sidewalk every morning, no matter what the world throws at him. In the young woman who lifts her phone despite her fear. In the son who walks into a courtroom carrying both love for his father and the weight of a federal badge. It shows us that patience isn't weakness. It's a deep well of resilience that can outlast hatred and broken systems. But the most moving truth is this: even when bitterness tempts us, even when exhaustion feels overwhelming, choosing grace over rage, truth over silency, and community over isolation can slowly bend the arc of justice toward light. Clarence sat beside the man who had lied about him, offered quiet forgiveness without forgetting, and kept tending his tomato garden and his church pantry. In doing so, he taught his sons, and all of us, that healing doesn't erase the wound, but it refuses to let the wound define the rest of our days. If Clarence's journey touched something deep inside you, if it stirred hope that ordinary courage still matters, drop a comment below and tell me, what small act of persistence has kept you going through your own difficult seasons? Share your story. I read every single one. And if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss the next tale of quiet strength, unexpected justice, and the beautiful resilience of the human spirit. Your support helps these important stories reach more hearts. Thank you for being here.